thank you to all the organizers of this conference, and especially Srishti and Alex, and all the students who are making this possible, and of course, thank you to the Azim Premji University, which invited us for this wonderful conference, 3 days conference. But today I will speak to you about Tugan-Baranovsky's ethical socialism, and it is just an invitation to visit a system, an economic system from the past, from an economist that is dead long ago already, more than 1 century ago. But I hope that this travel in the time will allow you to think of not only of how people thought in the past, but perhaps it will give you inspiration on how to do things today. So let's see. But before I start the speech, I would like to give you one quote by Tugan-Baranovsky, which I think is a better way of describing what should be the work of an economist. I quote, "Every accomplished social system consists of 3 parts: of the criticism of existing social conditions, of a determined conception of the future organization, and of considerations regarding the ways and means by which its principles are to be carried out in actual fact." So it's not just seeing what's around, but trying to transform it and think a bit about how to do it. Of course, this is the theory, and you will see that the practice is not always as simple as it is. Yet, before I start, perhaps you don't know all who was Tugan-Baranovsky, and therefore I prepared a few slides to give you some insight, which will be the occasion to show you the 3 only pictures that we have of him, pictures or paintings. He was born in Kharkiv in 1865. A few months ago I would have written Kharkov, but it is a city located in nowadays Ukraine. And he did his studies in natural science and then in economics in St. Petersburg, Kharkiv and Moscow. Not because he was keen of traveling between this city, but because he was expelled from St. Petersburg University. Why? Because he's just participated to a group of students who dreamt of executing the Tsar, which was not a good idea at the time, especially because of this group of students. The leader, who was a guy called Alexander Ulyanov, Alexander Ilyich Ulyanov, which was Lenin's elder brother, was sentenced to death, and the other members of the group were just sent back to the province for a few years with interdiction to come back to the 2 capitals, which was a standard practice at the time. So, he studied in Kharkiv because he could no longer study in Petersburg, and then he finished his studies in Moscow when the ban period was finished. He became a lecturer, and a successful one. His students were numerous, and they liked him because he was kind of a socialist, and this was really much more exciting than having this old German-like professors teaching in a boring way the teachings of the German historical school. And so he soon the faculty decided that he should be a professor. But then again, the Minister of Education waited 1 decade until it gave him the permission to become a professor, and once it became, he was once again exiled from St. Petersburg because he participated to a students' manifestation. So it is someone who flirted, let's say, with censorship and the political police, but who always managed to stay in the light and not in the ground of exile like many revolutionary economists. Perhaps the fact that his friend Alexander Ulyanov died because of when he was really young, learned him earlier than others how to behave in order not to be in such situation. And so he was a professor in Petersburg, and in 1917, in between the two revolutions, the February and the October one, he felt a rat, not only because Lenin called him an idiot and a bourgeois professor, but he fell a rat and decided to go back to his native Ukraine. And there were several independent governments that were fighting for creating an independent Ukraine between 1917 and 1921, and he became for 6 months Minister of Finance of what was called the Central Radas government, a kind of central right-wing government, which is kind of strange. But then he left and set up, or helped to set up, the economic branch of the Ukrainian Academy of Science. He died in 1919 on his way to Paris to the peace conference, and we don't know, there are several versions about that, whether he was escaping Ukraine and migrating to France, or whether he was just going to the peace conference. He wrote quite a few books, maybe 15, 20, and numerous articles. I just put here the main one. The one for which he's the main well-known is Industrial Crisis in England from 1894, the only one that entered the corpus, let's say, of mainstream economics at the time, because he inspired many German-based and then French and English-based theoretician of crisis and cycle, because he was one of the first to endogenize the crisis as part of a cycle. But he wrote many other things. I put here the titles in English, but only a few were translated into English. The Russian Factory, Modern Socialism, and that's all. Some other were translated into German or French, but there are quite a few that were never translated, especially my favorite, Principles of Political Economy, which gives the sense of Tugan-Baranovsky being a splendid teacher. Who was Tugan-Baranovsky? Next slide. He was a critical Marxist. That say, he was really deeply influenced by Marx, but he also had other influence that Marxists should not have. For example, Friedrich von Wieser or Heinrich Gossen and so on. Nowadays we would call it perhaps a heterodox Marxist, but at the time he was called a revisionist Marxist. It was a title that was also given in Germany to the right-wing branch of Marxism within the Social Democratic Party, to people like Bernstein, Edward Bernstein. And by the way, Bernstein is one of the people in Germany who likes Tugan-Baranovsky's work. He was also criticized among the Marxists by Lenin as being a legal Marxist. I don't know if you have ever heard this qualification of legal Marxist. A legal Marxist is a Marxist who can walk in the street legally without having to fear to being arrested, published in his own name, and so on and so on. He was nevertheless a convinced socialist, as I will try to convince you, and he's my favorite economist from the Russian Empire. But to give you nevertheless a proof that I am objective about him, let me show you then who was Tugan-Baranovsky as well. Tugan-Baranovsky is the name I gave to one of my two cats, and so I'm perfectly objective, and I kept the right distance with my object of studies, as you are now all aware. So, the motivation of this presentation is to show you the importance of ethics in Tugan-Baranovsky's theory of socialism. But it is also to show you the importance of ethics in economics in general. And you will decide for yourself whether it is a return to scholastic economic thought, or to, as we discussed today, within a session on Islamic economic thought as well, where ethics played an important role. And I will show you this in 3 steps, The first step is to show you how ethics enter within economic theory for Tugan-Baranovsky. The second step is to show you how ethics enters the analysis of capitalism by understanding the nature of the collapse of capitalism and the transition towards socialism. And the end is to show you how ethics enters into socialism through planning. So let's start if you're ready. Yeah, I had a digression, but I think I will not go into that about is Tugan-Baranovsky Russian or Ukrainian. This is a much debated question. So let's start with economic theory and ethics. For Tugan-Baranovsky, there are two kinds of science. Theoretical science driven by a theoretical interest and practical science that follow the practical interest. To give you one example, it is the fact that when you classify insects by species, you follow a theoretical interest, because when you find a new insect, you can classify it as part of a species or a subspecies, and so the classification helps you following your theoretical interest. But you can also follow a practical interest. And the practical interest here in this case is to understand how insects could be useful for humans. The mosquito is harmful for humans, the bee is useful, and the butterfly is beautiful and can be used to write poetry. And so normally, and at the time it was what was discussed already, in economics the theoretical science is called political economy, and the practical science is called economic policy, and theoretical science is what describes what is, and practical science what ought to be. But this is not the road chosen by Tugan-Baranovsky. His road was to show that within theoretical science there are two steps: the steps of description and the steps of explanation out of this description. And the first step, description, is already complicated by the fact that you have to choose what to describe. And he used the metaphor of the photographer versus the painter. If a photographer photographs a street, he takes every details of the street, but the painter cannot paint all the details and has to choose what to paint. And for that, the scientists use classification, and this classification help further collect facts, which will help further collect classification, improve the classification. And so for him, there is no description without a point of view. I say for him, but of course many other theoreticians arrive to that point of view. But he then asks, which point of view is political economy supposed to embrace? Take the example of wages. From the point of view of the worker, wages is an income. It's something positive. From the point of view of the capitalist, wage is an expense of production, among others. It is something negative. If wage goes up, it is good for the worker, it is bad for the capitalist. And so which point of view shall political economy choose? That of the worker, that of the capitalist? Both views are class-based, and this is where Tugan-Baranovsky starts to depart seriously from Marx already. He says we should not choose a class-based point of view because it's only partial, and we have to choose another view. And here, his reading of the German neo-Kantian philosophers, Windelband, Rickert, that were really popular at the time in Russia. There was a fashion at the end of, during the 1890s. They had a reading of Kant, which Tugan-Baranovsky just takes from them. Here it is. I quote Tugan-Baranovsky. By taking the point of view of ethics, and not the point of view of the capitalist or the point of view of the worker, we have the chance to rise above contradictory interests and find the universal practical interest that is a requirement for all humans endowed with a normal moral consciousness. The central idea in contemporary ethics was formulated by Kant as the idea of the supreme value and consequently the equal value of human personality, which means that no human is more important than another. No human beings is more important than another human beings. So, Tugan-Baranovsky has found his practical interest for political economy. Then he arrives at the conclusion that, political economy is not only what is, but it is what is the abstract part of political economy on the basis of the description of what is and what ought to be, because you have a point of view on what you describe from the concrete economic science. In the words of Tugan-Baranovsky, it goes like this: idealists and objective elements have their place together in economic theory only as long as the distinction is the natures is always clearly stated, as with water and oil, in the same receptacle, which will not mix even if they are immediate neighbors. You see that in the voice of Tugan-Baranovsky, the economic categories are coming alive. He used a lot of analogies, metaphors, and it makes his reading his text really pleasant. So in contemporary terms, we should say that ethics enters not only normative economics, but also positive economics for Tugan-Baranovsky. And here he has a problem with Marx, because Marx's Capital is supposed to be moral free, just a scientific text. And so moral free theory shall be rejected, so you reject Marx's Capital, or at least part of it, not everything, as you will see. And on the other side, he doesn't understand why Kant doesn't arrive at the conclusion by himself that private property should be rejected as well, because private property, when we will enter into the analysis of capitalism, is one of the main sources of exploitation. And so, Kant shall not be followed further than taking from him the normative, the ethical principle. So, Tugan-Baranovsky trying to go, and it was quite common in Germany and Russian at the time, beyond Marx and Kant, both together. I finish with the ethics in theory, and now I'll enter into the analysis of capitalism. The analysis of capitalism is mainly for Tugan-Baranovsky the study of the interaction between the individual and the collective, and what he calls, according to a long-standing German tradition, the individual economy, which is not quite clear what it is. It could be an individual, as in neoclassical economics, but it is often a family or an extended family. The individual economy is ruled by a master. So one people, the human will, takes decisions. But the national economy under capitalism has no master. There is not one single guy who say, okay, let's decide what to produce, let's decide how to consume. It is coming out of the interactions of the individual economies, and therefore we shall study these interactions. And to study that, he decided, following another German economist, Routledge, who was who inspired a bit, but who was also criticized by Marx. Routledge promoted the idea of logical versus historical categories within economic studies, and the idea that we shall study both. To give you an example, a logical category, I wrote logical economy. A logical category is a category that applies and that exists in every kind of society. And here he takes the example of labor. if you are a slave, labor exists in that society because the slave proceeds, the slave works. If you're under capitalism, labor still exists. If you are under socialism, at least unless intelligence artificial intelligence will make that disappear, but I really doubt it. Labor still exists. But for example, wage as a historical category does not exist under every type of economies. And so he discussed all the logical categories and all the historical categories. And the idea is that it will allow to denaturalize capitalism, because once you understand that the logical categories can take different historical instantiation in reality, then you may try to start thinking out of the box and to think and dream about another system. And to give you an example, it's a bit complicated, but value is the logical category for Tugan-Baranovsky, of which price is the historical manifestation under capitalism. And in the sphere of exchange and in the sphere of production, Tugan-Baranovsky found that, and this is another reason why the Marxists hated him so much, he found that marginal utility is perfectly explaining value from the sphere of exchange, while labor cost, what it costs to human beings to produce something under present technical conditions, is what determines value in the sphere of production. Is it possible to make an understanding in the logical sphere between marginal utility and labor cost? I will come to that later, but let me already say that Tugan-Baranovsky is known for his synthesis between marginal utility and labor value, and that he will launch a school in Russia of mathematical economists that will follow this track, encompassing Dmitriev, Shaposhnikov, Yurovsky, and a few others, and that this school will last until 1919 and then collapse. In capitalism, marginal utility in the sphere of exchange becomes exchange value, or price as he called them, and in the sphere of production, the labor costs transform into expenses of production. And there is a discrepancy between labor costs and expenses of production. There are many complications between them, and it is in these complications that Tugan-Baranovsky interprets the Marxian transformation problem, of which he will be one of the first to give a solution, let's say a solution to the inverse transformation problem, to go from the historical to the logical categories. For Tugan-Baranovsky, there is no solution under capitalism, but you will see when we will reach the socialist chapter that he might have found a way to circumvent this century-long problem. I don't want to make you wait too long. I mean, it is not really sound as as a solution. But let's follow him. Here, maybe the most, terrible slide of my presentation. Tugan-Baranovsky in 1894 was the first ever, until someone proves the contrary, to not to copy the schemes of reproduction of Marx, but he was the first to dare modify them. And this is the source of his revisionism, one of the sources. He modified them so as to tell another story. And this other story is a story with three periods. with three sectors. Sector 1 in the first line, the sector that produces the means of production. Sector 2, the sector that produces the means of consumption for the workers. Sector 3, the sector that produces the means of consumption for the capitalist, so the luxury goods. And in this example, Tugan-Baranovsky wants to show the following, that capitalism can accumulate in the first sector, the one who produces means of production, even by restraining themselves to consume more luxury goods. You see that the third line in each period is always at 600. They decided that 600 is enough for capitalists. And they decided, I mean, there are several interpretations that he gives. Either he decided to reduce the wage of the workers of 25% at each period, which would become a bit complicated after some times, or he decided that the new capital introduce technological improvement, and this makes that it requires 25% less of workers. And you will see in the second lines of each period that the amount of goods produced for the consumption of the workers goes from 680 to 621 to 606. You make the working class collapsing. And if you produce, I mean, if there is, but there are a lot of if in history. If you, if the capital is allocated to the right sectors, you may find a situation in which the first sector grows indefinitely, more and more. The third sector stays the same, and the second sectors shrinks. This is what made Rosa Luxemburg mad. He called that the manège of Tugan-Baranovsky. Many economists, but for Tugan-Baranovsky it was not a description of reality, of course. It was just an absurd assumption to prove that capitalism may theoretically arrive at a situation that even with one worker left in the society, it will not have problems of outlets. You will always find someone, a capitalist, buying a machine to produce another machine that will be able to produce other machine that will produce machine. And so perhaps at one time, at one period in time when there will be too much in the first sector, they could open the third sector for many luxury goods and try to transform all the iron into silk and caviar. But then there will be only one worker left, so there might be some problem. But the idea is to go and give a proof by the absurd. Let me just tell you that I give these tables to my students to compute. I give the first period, then I give them the rules, and I tell them, draw the second table, draw the third table. And one year, a student drew the fourth table to see how it goes and to see if he had really well understood the story. And he told me, I think I made a mistake, because in the fourth period, the second sector is going up again. But he made no mistake. It took 1 century until someone noticed that. Giorgio Colaccio in Italy was the first apparently to draw the fourth period. And it doesn't work. Why? Because even if you shrink the second period, it's a relative shrinkage. And as the first sector grows, you will need workers to work in that sector. Even if you reduce by 25% every year, they need. It's 25% of a more and ever more growing first sector. And so this is just an invitation, especially for students in the room, to not believe that when you have 3 tables, you should not compute the 4th one and discover something. It is worth, of course, a paper in a nice journal. So never just trust what people write, but test by yourself, play by yourself, and perhaps you will go to that. But nevertheless, people took the argument and argue against that. But the conclusion of this analysis of capitalism is that there is a theoretical possibility that no general crisis of overproduction arise. And because of that, because of the possibility of technological improvement, he also proved with other schemes of production that I will not show you, that the law of the weight of profit to fall is by no means forced to fall, and therefore nothing guarantees, there is no guarantee that capitalism will fall alone out of its internal contradictions. That's his stance. But capitalism has to collapse for Tugan-Baranovsky out of ethical reasons. And for that reason, we should help him collapse. That's why the organization of the workers in political parties, in syndicates, in unions is absolutely necessary. Why is capitalism such an antagonistic system? Tugan-Baranovsky drew typology, he liked typologies like economists in the 19th century, of antagonistic and harmonious economic system. He defines the harmonious economic system in which the interests of one individual are in harmony with the interests of the other individual. And for 3 stages of economic development, it's not the 4th stage, but the 3 stage here, he finds an antagonist and a harmonious economic system: slavery, serfdom, capitalism, to which corresponds the primitive economy, the mercantile society in a Sismondi way of being, that is where everyone is a small owner of his own means of production, and socialism that still needs to be invented. And why has capitalism to be rejected? Simply because it condemns the workers to excessive work and a miserable life. It is enough. You don't need Capital, Volume 1, to say that, according to Tugan-Baranovsky. And also, because he studied that a lot, in the absence of an economic plan at the national level, because there are many economic plans in capitalism, in each enterprise, each firm, everyone has his plan, but the interaction between the different plans makes that crises are unavoidable. And he devoted most of his industrial crisis in England not to the theory of crisis, but to the social consequences of crisis. And I just put here the 2 books in which Tugan-Baranovsky wrote about capitalism at most. The first, industrial crisis in England, he wanted to understand how a more advanced stage of capitalism worked. And by the way, as a byproduct, he made the world science moving forward, but it was only a byproduct. And then, most importantly for him, he produced this book, The Russian Factory, an economic history book that was designed to show that capitalism was developing in Russia, and therefore that we should wait for the catastrophe of capitalism that will also come. That's for capitalism. So you see that ethics just says we should not live in an antagonistic system. And especially if this one will not fall out of its internal contradictions. So far, I think Tugan-Baranovsky is more right than Marx, but we don't have the answer because we are not at the end of history. And now I will enter into socialism. The opposition of science and utopia is untenable in the sense that science and utopia are not necessarily contradictory concepts. Utopia is not absurd or ridiculous. Utopia is an ideal plays the role of a star, thanks to which a stray night traveler chooses his road. Far away, the beautiful star indicates the true path. But it does not replace the convenient and mundane lantern. And if an ideal can be compared with a star, science plays the role of the lantern. With a lantern, not knowing where to go, one does not find the true path. But without a lantern at night, one risks breaking his neck. The ideal, as well as science, is equally necessary for life. The ideal gives us the supreme goal of our activities. Science shows the means for implementing this objective and provides us with a correct criterion for determining what is feasible in our goals and to what extent. Here, Tugan-Baranovsky is bringing back all the utopian socialists that Engels especially had pushed forward out of scientific socialism, to say that it's unscientific to discard where we want to go. Where we want to go, it's not science that should decide, it is us. And so, socialism for Tugan-Baranovsky, that's the smaller definition that I have found, we define socialism as the social organization in which, owing to equal obligation and equal rights of all to participate in the communal work, as also owing to the equal right to participate in the produce of this work, the exploitation of one member of the community by another is impossible. That's quite tricky, because as you will see, perhaps you are not exploited by another member, but perhaps by the society itself. This is something that in every socialist system I've never seen something that you can express in that way. You remember my value and prices in capitalism. Now I will ask you to think like Tugan-Baranovsky and think what should be the historical manifestation of the logical value, of the logical category of value under socialism. In other words, how should the socialist price came out of logical categories that become socialist? Labor cost is labor cost. Why should we choose something else? Marginal utility is marginal utility. But yeah, I put the word social here and I will make a comment in the next slide about that. But under socialism, logical and historical categories coincide. And by the way, the transformation of value into price is solved, but only under socialism. Because for every logical hour of labor cost, there is a socialist hour of labor cost. This should sound a bit abstract to you, and I will try to make this a bit more concrete with Tugan-Baranovsky's original example of a community that intends to produce its first socialist economic plan. Let's imagine, and here we are almost in a classroom, that a society produces two goods, potatoes and cucumbers. That it takes 1 unit of labor to produce 1 unit of potatoes and 2 units of labor to produce 1 unit of cucumber under present technical conditions. Let's assume as well that this society have found a solution in the kind of social welfare function that gives social marginal utilities to every quantity of both goods. let's assume for this example that this society likes potatoes as much as cucumbers. I mean, the Russian likes potatoes and cucumbers. I don't know if you know that, but they like both. And so what are these numbers? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. All those who studied neoclassical economics or the marginalist revolution will see here Menger's or Böhm-Bawerk's table horizontally aligned instead of vertically, and you will see just that you have a marginal utility of 10 if you consume 1 unit of potatoes. You have an additional marginal utility of 9 if you consume a second utility, a second unit of potato, then 8, then 7, then 6, then 5. And so the question is, if this society has only at its disposal 8 hours of labor, at its disposal it's a decision, because you may decide to sleep less, you may decide to take 4 hours of leisure time, 2 hours of nap every day. But once you decided that you have 8 hours of labor, how should these 8 hours be distributed? Of course, for Tugan-Baranovsky, and here if you are a Marxist you are going to be mad, by maximizing total utility. And so the first 2 units of labor should of course not go to cucumbers, because it brings only 10, but to potatoes, 10 plus 9. Then the 2 next should go to 8 plus 6 plus 7. Then the 2 next to 6 plus 5. It's still more than 10. But then 4 plus 3 is worse than 10. So you will produce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units of A and 1 unit of B. You maximize your total utility, and with this magical numerical discrete example, you arrived at the result that the marginal utilities of A, which is 5, and of B, which is 10, are proportional to the labor cost, 1 and 2. This proportionality between labor cost and marginal utility is what we can call the simple version of Tugan-Baranovsky's synthesis in the theory of value and socialist price. And in this synthesis, Tugan-Baranovsky sees that ethics is called back because you consider equally the wants of the people, their marginal utility, and the sacrifice for these people, the labor cost. It's not the consumer's point of view nor the producer point of view, both are included. And it's neither someone else's point of view. Of course, what is social marginal utility in a Russian village? Is it the patriarch who chooses, or are the people making a poll, voting with an app, and then deciding what is better for them? You see already here that Tugan-Baranovsky has not solved all the social problems with his theory. He then goes further, yet another typology, to say, okay, what kind of system shall we build based on this planning? Because you can make central planning, but Tugan-Baranovsky saw that not only economic security was important for people, but also freedom. And if you make central planning, you decide at a much, much more bigger level, and you reduce the liberty, the freedom of many minorities who has other cultural tastes and so on. And so the less centralist, the more liberty, the more freedom. And the more centralist, the more productive you are, so the more economic security you get. And therefore, he proposed, out of all the systems that he studied in the history of utopian socialists, where he found centralist proposition, corporate proposition, federal proposition, and anarchist proposition, he proposed that Okay, let's take one because it's important for a few goods that needs perhaps more central planning, and let's take 2, 3, and 4 for the goods that that could be more localized and in which it is less important that we have, less, economy of scales for those. And there is also the difference between socialism and communism, on which once again Tugan-Baranovsky has yet another definition. For him, it's not about private property, or it's about the fact that do you have an income or don't you have an income? If you have an income, it's socialism. With an income, you can choose what to buy. With communism, you cannot choose, but either it's for good because there is enough for everyone, or it's for a bit less good because there is a restriction on how much you can have of each good. And so his proposition is to keep for socialism, but to increase the number of goods that could be given through communism as long as they can be offered to everyone, like education, health, library, transport, non-luxury food, lodging, and so on and so on. That's his practical proposition. Because he studied other practical propositions like building a federation of cooperatives, but he soon realized that capitalism was coming back in these cooperatives. And so, I'm soon at the end. Tugan-Baranovsky's theory of socialism was never applied somewhere. I'm not telling you about the history of an economic policy, but about a history of a theory that is still in the air. It was nevertheless very present in the minds of his followers, disciples, students, both in the Soviet Union, especially during the NEP period and the beginning of the 5-year plan period, and abroad, all those who exiled themselves. He really was the Russian Marshal. He played this role of being one of the most influential Russian economists in his generation in St. Petersburg. And so there are, of course, a lot of difficulties in his construction. Among them, the notion of social marginal utility. But I think that it demonstrates a fruitful inclusion of ethics within the theoretical world of economic theory, and that his legacy constitutes a reminder to always reconsider the distinction between positive and so-called normative economics, and I think to always try to look for a brighter future. And I leave you with the quotation with which I started. May it inspire you. Thank you.